Once a drafting team has been appointed, its first task should be to analyze the context carefully to establish exactly what problems the new law needs to solve. This will help to ensure that the law is correctly targeting the right problem and also gives officials a chance to see how the whole system operates and understand why change is needed. The team will need to consider legal, economic, geographic, demographic, political, social, and historical contexts. Let's talk about each of these in a bit more detail. Firstly, the legal context. The obvious place to start is with what laws are currently in place and how widely respected these laws are. It's also important to consider legal and administrative infrastructure. How much capacity does the system have to implement new laws and regulations? What about appeal processes? Will your law add to regulatory burdens or reduce them? Consider also the traditions of legal interpretation in the country. How important is statutory interpretation relative to judicial precedent? This is especially important if drafters come from countries with different legal traditions. In places where it's more common to operate outside the law than inside the law, it's important to consider the informal governance structures that may already be in place and how the new law can address and include them. Economic context is about what drives economic activity and how people earn their livelihoods. What's the balance between formal and informal economies and between small and large businesses? To what extent is it possible to raise local tax revenues? Under geographic and demographic context, consider things like how fast the city's population is growing and where new residents are coming from, what kinds of landholdings exist, and how buildings are constructed. Political context refers to how the city is governed. What's the relative strength of and the relationship between local municipal administrations, national governments, and regional governments? How are public funds allocated between these different levels? A realistic analysis of what does and does not work in the country's political system will determine which aspects of a new law can be effectively implemented. The social context includes issues of gender, ethnic and cultural differences, and social inequality. Will the law need to make special provisions to protect the interests of women? Laws that are entirely gender neutral run the risk of perpetuating or worsening existing gender inequality, especially when property rights are affected. In many cases, the drafting team and the officials running the process are all men, so this is an important issue. Ethnic and cultural differences are also important to consider. Does one group dominate? And is there political will to change this? Addressing exclusion is a central part of each country's international obligations, and it will be useful for the drafting team to be familiar with the relevant provisions of the applicable United Nations agreements and conventions. Consider also the extent to which any proposed law will differently affect the rich and the poor, including the costs of compliance and of asserting rights. Finally, it's also important to look at history. History repeats itself. Have similar laws tried to achieve the same objective in the past and failed? What can be learned from these failures? Sometimes the drafting team will need to look at the experiences of more than 50 years ago.